Welcome to our day school on crime fiction. My name is David Grills. I'm the director of Oxford University's continuing education programme in literature, and I'm the organiser and chair today. You will have noticed already that we're in a different venue from usual. Some of you, I'm sure, have been to day schools in Rewley House. This particular event proved so popular that we had to relocate. And knowing how people who read crime fiction like to have a challenge and to follow clues, we picked this particular auditorium as a test of wits at the outset of the day. And I'm going to stick to time very strictly today because, as you know from the programme, although coffee and tea will be served here in the middle of the morning and the middle of the afternoon, lunch, for those of you who are booked in for lunch, will be served at Rewley House. You have maps. It's the other side of St Giles. Do be careful in the middle of the day, if you're in a state of excitement about the first two lectures, not to get run over as you cross St Giles. It's okay if you get murdered, because we've got enough people on the panel today who would be able to detect the murderer. But anyway, do be careful, and I hope that you get back in time in the afternoon. Coffee and tea, actually, when we end this session, you go out of the auditorium here and then turn left and follow it round, and there's a large room on the left where coffee and tea will be served. Well, it's my pleasure now to introduce our first speaker, who will be, I think, known to some people who have attended events at Rewley House. He's Peter Kemp. He is currently the chief fiction reviewer of the Sunday Times, and he's a visiting fellow of Kellogg College, Oxford. Peter is one of those people who did something that a lot of academics dream of doing, that is starting as a university lecturer and ending up as a broadcaster and journalist. He, as an academic, wrote a number of critical books on Muriel Spark, on H.G. Wells, on Edith Wharton, and since then he has edited the Oxford Dictionary of Literary Quotations. He's a regular broadcaster on Radio 3, Radio 4, programmes like Night Waves and Front Row and Saturday Review and The Right Stuff, for which he has to write parodies of authors. But he has a long-standing, in fact, lifelong interest in crime fiction, and so I thought he would be a good person to give the overview at the beginning of the day. We're going to welcome him back later when he speaks to Ruth Rendell and P.D. James. His title is Cluedo and Cadavers, History of Crime Fiction, so please welcome Peter Kemp.
Thank you very much indeed, David, and thank you, everyone. Good morning. Well, as David has just said, what I want to talk about this morning is British detective fiction, the murder mystery, the whodunit. And I've called my talk Cluedo and Cadavers in order to highlight what I see as the two central and contrasting features of the genre. On the one hand, The Whodunit is a book that presents you with a challenging puzzle. It's a kind of fictional game. In fact, it's very like a literary equivalent of Cluedo, the board game that in which you have to work out who killed Dr. Black, or Mr. Body, as he's a bit obviously called in the American version of the game. What was it, Professor Plum in the library with a candlestick, or was it Colonel Mustard in the conservatory with a chunk of lead piping? It's something that's nicely unreal. It's an entertaining brain teaser that tests your powers of observation and deduction, or just your skill or luck at guessing. On the other hand, The Whodunit isn't just a game. It's a game that involves something that we usually take very seriously indeed: corpses, cadavers, violent death. It's a kind of pastime that plays with very gruesome material, which makes it sound a very strange kind of genre. But the classic whodunit, which brings these two elements together, the Cluedo aspect and the cadaver aspect, has actually proved to be one of the most popular and long-enduring of literary genre. I think its popularity is testified to by the fact that there are so many of you here this morning that we actually had to change the venue because it's something that people so like talking about. I would say that the detective story is perhaps the most popular literary genre ever to develop in the UK and the United States. It's a kind of novel that has been compulsively attractive to enormous numbers of readers. Dorothy L. Sayers, who was one of the most famous writers of detective fiction during its so-called golden age, the period between the two world wars, the 1920s and the 1930s, basically. Dorothy L. Sayers once said, "Death seems to provide the mind of the Anglo-Saxon race with a greater fund of amusement than any other single subject." And it's a fund of amusement that has now spread far wider, of course, than Anglo-Saxon writers and readers, the kind of people that Dorothy L. Sayers was thinking about. The whodunit genre is now very much to the fore internationally. You get detective stories coming from Scandinavia, particularly Sweden and Norway. They come from Iceland, Italy, Spain, Russia, many other countries as well. There's a current boom, I would say, in international whodunits spread out across the globe, and simultaneously there's a boom in historical detective fiction, which goes back in time, most frequently to ancient Rome or Tudor England. So the whodunit is a genre that is very vigorously thriving. And what I would like to do today is to, first of all, look briefly at how crime fiction began. What were its starting points? Who could claim to be the first detective story writer? Then I'd like to move on to look at the development of the genre and what it was like during its between the wars golden age, its enormously popular heyday, or in fact I feel I should perhaps say during its first enormously popular heyday, its first golden age, because it does seem to me that crime fiction is currently enjoying a second golden age, both as regards books and television drama about detection. And lastly, I'd like to talk about what the detective novel has evolved into in our time and what its prospects of survival as an enormously popular kind of writing are. Well, crime and murder go back a very, very long way in literature, of course. You've hardly started reading the Bible, for instance, before you come upon the story of Cain murdering Abel. Greek drama is packed with homicide. But of course, you couldn't really call the Bible, or the book of Genesis, the first detective story, because what's crucially missing is the mystery element. You don't need to search for motive, means, and opportunity to be certain that it was Cain who killed Abel. You don't need to be Sherlock Holmes or Hercule Poirot or even God to be absolutely certain that he was the criminal. I mean, there's hardly a wide range of suspects, for one thing. There's hardly anybody around. And when it comes to concealing the crime, Cain has an awful lot to learn, really, from subsequent criminals, I think. It's a similar state of affairs with Greek tragedy. I mean, there's not usually any obscurity about who committed a murder in Greek drama or why they did it. The emphasis tends to fall on the consequences of the crime for the perpetrator of it or for the state in general. The whodunit element, with all its accompanying apparatus of red herrings, clues, suspects with wonky alibis and so on, is something that's much more recent. And it seems to me that, like a lot of excellent literary things, crime fiction really began in the 19th century. There's a lot of disagreement as to which book could claim to be the first detective story, but it's generally agreed that the period when the whodunit form emerged was around the middle of the 19th century. If you're interested in this, there's a particularly good book that appeared this year. It's by Judith Flanders, and it's called The Invention of Murder. And the subtitle is How the Victorians Revelled in Death and Detection and Created Modern Crime. I think that subtitle should really read How the Victorians Revelled in Death and Detection and Created Crime Fiction, because what the book shows you is the way that the crime novel, as we now are aware of it, started to slowly pull itself out of a fascination with crime during the 19th century. Judith Flanders shows you very brilliantly, very copiously, documents the 19th century fascination with real-life murder cases, the very lurid newspaper reports of crimes and executions, the gory plays and ballads that were written about the victims and about the murderers. And in the later sections of her book, she suggests how this started to be refined into the detective novel, because what she shows you, of course, is that the Victorians weren't just fascinated by crime, they were fascinated by investigation into crime and by the new phenomenon of the detective policeman. And there's another very engrossing recent book in connection with this that I would recommend as well. It's a book that came out in 2008. It's by Kate Summerscale, and it's called The Suspicions of Mr. Witcher. The Suspicions of Mr. Witcher. And what it does is to describe the investigations conducted by a real-life policeman, Inspector Witcher, into a horrible crime that very much seized the attention of the public imagination in 1860. It's a crime that's often referred to as the Constance Kent murder case. Basically, it was a crime in which the body of a child was discovered horribly killed in a very wealthy establishment, a rather isolated house. It was a real-life incident, and it, as I say, created a huge amount of interest amongst the public at the time. It's a real-life incident that is like an anticipation of all the kind of country house mysteries and isolated house murder cases that we've since become used to. So the emergence of the policeman was important as a first step towards crime fiction. And in fact, the first important policeman, really, to play a detective-like role in any significant way in Victorian fiction is Inspector Bucket in Charles Dickens' novel Bleak House, which was 1852 to 1853. He was based on a real-life policeman, not Inspector Witcher, a man called Inspector Field, who Dickens knew and admired. And in Bleak House, Inspector Bucket solves a murder mystery. He discovers who killed the respectable lawyer, Mr. Tulkinghorn, and he tracks down the killer. And not for the last time in British crime fiction, the killer turns out to be an overexcitable foreigner, a passionately deranged French maid. But although Bucket is the first significant criminal investigation in British fiction, I think, you couldn't possibly claim that Bleak House is the first whodunit, because the murder story in that novel isn't central to it. It's just really background sensation material to other things that the author is more interested in doing. A novel in which a whodunit mystery is central was one that was written by Dickens' friend and professional associate, Wilkie Collins. It's The Moonstone, which was published a decade and a half after Bleak House it was published in 1868. And I know that P.D. James, who we'll be hearing from later, regards it actually as the first whodunit. I mean, it's a novel that certainly has all the elements you'd associate with the genre. The crime takes place in a closed community. It takes place in a house that's been shut in for the night. There's a very limited circle of suspects. There are a lot of clues and false leads and multiple motives and suspicious behaviour. And there's an investigating policeman called Inspector Cuff, who is very closely modelled on Inspector Witcher. But the only problem, I think, about the claim for The Moonstone to be the first detective book is that the crime isn't murder. The crime in The Moonstone is the theft of a fabulously valuable jewel that's been brought back from India, where it was looted from a temple. And so it's not the murder mystery that The Moonstone pioneers. Wilkie Collins, who was a leading exponent, he's very good at spotting market trends, as it were, amongst readership in the 19th century. He'd spotted, I think, the appetite for this kind of material. I mean, he was a leading exponent of the sensation novel that gave the readers lots and lots of very wild, lurid adventures. He saw the potential of the whodunit genre, but he didn't push it towards what became its ultimate and almost platonically ideal form, the murder mystery. The writer who nearly did this was Charles Dickens. His last novel, The Mystery of Edwin Drood, which was published in 1870, did actually put what seems to be a murder, the disappearance and amid murky circumstances of a young man, Edwin Drood. It puts that right at its centre. And again, when you read Edwin Drood, I think you feel that you're in the realm of detective fiction. There's a small circle of suspects again. There are clues, evidence of disguise, plenty of suspicious behaviour, especially from Edwin's opium-addicted Uncle Jasper. Jasper's normally a name that rings warning bells in 19th century fiction and plays anyway. And Jasper, living up to his name really, seems to have dark designs on the girl that Edwin is in love with. There's even something that later plays a very prominent role in detective fiction during the Golden Age, and that's an ultra-respectable, very genteel setting. Detective writers love to, especially in the 20s and 30s, they love to juxtapose the deadly and the decorous to make terrible things happen in places like Torquay and Cheltenham and vicarages and so on. What Dickens does in Edwin Drood is to place the mystery inside a cathedral close. It all sounds promisingly as though he'd come up with the first murder mystery, but of course he didn't, because he died before he could complete the mystery of Edwin Drood. We don't know who the murderer was, and in fact we can't even be 100% certain that there was a murder and that Edwin Drood isn't going to reappear alive before the end of the novel. And it's all very frustrating and tantalising, especially as Dickens told a close associate of his that he changed his mind about the plot of Edwin Drood as he was writing it, and he'd thought of something incredibly ingenious, but rather hard to pull off in the plot, but he was sure he could do it, and annoyingly, he didn't live to do it. And I always think it's a pity that Dickens didn't finish it, because given his lifelong fascination with murder and its effects, it would have been nicely appropriate if he'd pioneered the murder mystery story. But I suppose I would have to add that even if he had lived to finish The Mystery of Edwin Drood, he couldn't really have claimed to be the pioneer of the genre, because it seems to me that the real influential inventor of the investigative crime novel was an American. It was Edgar Allan Poe. In the 1840s, Edgar Allan Poe wrote 3 stories that he called Tales of Ratiocination. I can imagine that on the bookshelves nowadays. It would leap off the shelves, wouldn't it? Tales of Ratiocination, Tales of Reasoning, Tales of Using Your Mind. And there were 3 of them, as I say. First one was The Murders in the Rue Morgue, 1841. then The Mystery of Marie Roget in 1842, and The Purloined Letter 3 years later, 1845. And it's The Murders in the Rue Morgue, the first one, that really offers the combination of violent death and puzzle solving that I think obviously hallmarks the genre we're going to be looking at from different angles today. The mystery that The Murders in the Rue Morgue poses is an exceptionally grisly one. Shrieks are heard coming from an apparently sealed room in Paris. The Murders in the Rue Morgue is also not just the first detective story, it's also the first sealed room detective story as well. Terrible shrieks are heard coming from this apparently sealed room. When people break in, a mother and her daughter are found killed in the most hideous way. They've both suffered absolutely terrible injuries, which Edgar Allan Poe, given his usual style of writing, absolutely lingers over with great delight. It's like the most appalling autopsy report, reading page after page in the early parts of that novel. And amongst the many horrors, macabre horrors, is the fact that the daughter's body has been discovered stuffed head downwards up the chimney of the apartment. It's something you feel that Miss Marple would have blenched at, having to investigate this kind of thing. Well, the question is, who can have perpetrated this horrible crime? Almost the only clue, apart from a piece of ribbon, which is knotted in a very peculiar, rather distinctive way, but the only clue is that the appalled witnesses outside the apartment subsequently heard two voices inside it. A gruff one, which was speaking in French, basically saying things like "mon Dieu," and a much shriller one in a language that no one can confidently recognise. And rather conveniently, to emphasise this fact, the people standing outside include a Russian, an Italian, a Frenchman, a German, a Briton one. So it's a pretty good linguistic checklist that you get there. There isn't an Inuit there, I think, but they feel it's probably not likely to be something. So it all seems a bit of a baffler. And it's at this point that you get the entry of a private investigator, Auguste Dupin. Auguste Dupin is a brilliant eccentric who's a friend of the man who's narrating the story, with whom he shares bachelor quarters in Paris. And when Dupin is called in to investigate this sickening double murder, he's not in the least bit revolted by the horrible details of the butchery. He's engrossed by them. He says, an inquiry will afford us amusement. And along with his narrator and sidekick, he keenly sets about solving the crime. And he does it by inspecting the clues, bravura deduction from this. He unravels everything that's happened. He even manages to unpick the mystery behind the strange knot. And he uncovers what happens, as I say, and he reveals the killer. And I think this is the moment when the detective story, as we know it, is born and is set on its course. But it was later writers who gave the detective story the push into really widespread popularity that it needed. Poe's story gives you a prototype of it, but there are weaknesses. I mean, Poe is a rather prolific, sprawling writer. He often uses rather long, clumsy words. The thing is not very skillfully put together. The person who learned a lot from Edgar Allan Poe's story and who really did launch the detective story, I think, on its enormously popular subsequent course, is Arthur Conan Doyle, whose central character, Sherlock Holmes, is for many people the consummate detective. Sherlock Holmes isn't an entirely original concept. He actually owes an awful lot to Edgar Allan Poe's Auguste Dupin. I said that one of Edgar Allan Poe's tales of ratiocination was called The Purloined Letter. And I sometimes think that Sherlock Holmes could initially seem like the purloined character because he shares so many features with Auguste Dupin. He's like him in that he's a genius at observation and deduction. He has a self-confidence that goes into arrogance. He's given to strange-seeming whims and to asking very peculiar questions that later turn out to be astonishingly well-directed. And he's pretty much a loner. His only apparent relationship is with his slower-witted, admiring housemate, Dr. Watson, who tells the stories of his detective adventures. It's no wonder, in fact, that in the first of the Sherlock Holmes stories, Dr. Watson, who's just met Holmes, says to him, "You remind me of Edgar Allan Poe's Dupin." Of course he does. He's been pulled out of the pages, practically. And of course, as well, Holmes is absolutely affronted and insulted at the comparison and says Dupin was a very inferior fellow, really very showy and superficial. Conan Doyle's stroke of genius, I think, is to take over the brainy detective excitements of the Auguste Dupin stories, but to enormously humanize them. For instance, he makes the relationship between the detective and his narrator companion something much warmer and funnier and more interesting than it is in the Edgar Allan Poe stories. And also, he surrounds the two central figures, Holmes and Watson, with a really vivid cast of characters from a wide range of places, who are all, of course, seeking solutions to bizarrely puzzling problems. The other thing that Conan Doyle does is to make the mysteries and the murders less blood-curdling than they are in Edgar Allan Poe. And also, he heightens the emphasis even more on solving a mystery by the process of reason. With the Sherlock Holmes stories, I would say, the balance shifts even more from, if you like, the cadaver, the flesh-creeping aspect of the whodunit, to the Cluedo aspect, the brain-teaser aspect of it. And as a result, the detective genre really captures the public imagination and appeals to a vastly wider audience, not just fans of the macabre and grotesque and eccentric as you would have had with Poe. Conan Doyle introduced Sherlock Holmes to the public in a novella called A Study in Scarlet that was published in Beaton's Christmas Annual in 1887, and didn't actually make that much of an impact compared with the later stories. It was the later publications that did this. I mean, what Conan Doyle did was he started publishing shorter stories in the Strand magazine. That's the magazine in which you get the famous, iconic Sidney Paget illustrations that stamp on your image of Holmes, the deerstalker hat and the pipe and so on. And for over 40 years, 56 stories were published in the Strand magazine. It was a very sort of successful magazine, and one that really reached out to the public in lots of ways, gave free gifts and so on. And that all helped the launch of the genre, I think. In total then, Conan Doyle published 56 Holmes stories and 4 novellas. And what happens in them is that the powers of reason are pitted against the forces of criminal confusion. Sherlock Holmes' main weapon in solving crimes isn't his magnifying glass, it's logic. Logic based on very close observation of data and deductions drawn from this data. What it reminds you of course, is scientific procedure. It's a world in which you have theory tested by evidence. And it's interesting, if you go back to the A Study in Scarlet and look at it, the very first time you see Sherlock Holmes, it's not as you would expect. He's not in number 221B Baker Street. He's in a laboratory. He's holding a test tube. And his first words are a sort of eureka moment, cry of delight. I found it, I found it. And what he's found is a reagent which is precipitated by hemoglobin and by nothing else. He's found an infallible test for bloodstains. So Holmes is linked with science right from the beginning. And I think he was linked with science, actually, when Conan Doyle was dreaming him up, because Sherlock Holmes is partly based on a doctor and lecturer, Professor Joseph Bell, who was the person who taught Conan Doyle at Medical College in Edinburgh, and Conan Doyle subsequently worked for him for a while. And it was Bell was famous for being able to spot clues as to illnesses and work out what was happening in a way that often astonished people around him. So he was, besides Auguste Dupin, he was also a model for Sherlock Holmes, which enormously enraged him. He spoke of the Sherlock Holmes stories as a cataract of drivel. And of course, other people saw them as anything but a cataract of drivel, and complained very loudly when this cataract dried up, and Sherlock Holmes apparently toppled to his death at the Reichenbach Falls. And as you no doubt remember, Conan Doyle had to resurrect Sherlock Holmes after trying to kill him off. Well, in the Holmes stories then, you get the blueprint for a huge amount of subsequent crime fiction. There's a bizarre puzzle, a bewildering crime, which often occurs in very ordinary or very respectable seeming surroundings. Called in to deal with it is a partnership of two sleuths. One of them is a genius of almost superhuman acute powers of observation and deduction. He's arrogant and he's lordly in manner. And the other one is much more human and humane, as well as more genially obtuse. He's good-hearted, but he's a bit slow on the uptake. And he's actually an enormously reassuring presence for the reader, because you think that, well, I may not be as brilliant as Sherlock Holmes, but I'm not quite as dim as what Dr. Watson may be. So it's a very nicely done balance, I think. And it's a formula that has shown this. I mean, it's extraordinary to find a fictional formula lasting so long. I mean, if you look at so many crime novels nowadays, you find it's the same thing. You get one bright detective who's often socially dysfunctional in various ways, and he's got a sidekick who you'd much rather talk to in a way, you'd feel more relaxed with, and who's very useful for asking the sort of slightly slow questions that help people to keep up. I mean, you just see it all the time. In Agatha Christie developed it. You have Poirot, but then you've got people like the policeman Jopp and Hastings, it is, isn't it, in Agatha Christie and so on. So it's a formula that has really lasted. The other element is that there's usually an incompetent or bumptious policeman on the fringes of things as well, walking in the wrong direction. Lestrade in the Sherlock Holmes stories, Inspector Jopp rather in Agatha Christie, Strange in the Colin Dexter Morse novels. And then after all of this, there's a surprising, or indeed an astonishing conclusion, whose satisfaction comes from a virtuoso sifting of real clues from red herrings. The major component of this kind of fiction's appeal is the reader being tantalized and baffled and finally discovering whether his or her hunches were right or hopelessly wrong. And it's a fictional blueprint that has proved just enormously appealing to huge numbers of people. The poet W.H. Auden, who once wrote a famous essay about crime fiction and its appeal called The Guilty Vicarage, said, "For me, as for many others, the reading of detective stories is an addiction like tobacco or alcohol." And the writer who whipped this addiction up into an absolute frenzy was the most prolifically ingenious practitioner of it, Agatha Christie, who by 1980 was the world's third best-selling author after Shakespeare and the Bible. Like Conan Doyle, Agatha Christie wasn't entirely a pioneer. Just as he borrowed from Edgar Allan Poe, she borrowed from him. She was a great admirer of the Sherlock Holmes stories, which actually the later ones overlapped with the start of her own literary career. And if you look at the first Agatha Christie novel, The Mysterious Affair at Styles, which she wrote in 1917, and it was published in 1920, if you look at it, it's astonishing how much it owes to the first Sherlock Holmes novella, A Study in Scarlet. A Study in Scarlet begins with a man invalided home from the Afghan wars, Dr. Watson, striking up an acquaintance with a brilliant eccentric who's a fussy bachelor with uncanny detecting skills, Sherlock Holmes. The Mysterious Affair at Styles opens with a man invalided home from the First World War, Colonel Hastings, becoming friendly with a brilliant eccentric who's a fussy bachelor with uncanny detecting skills called Hercule Poirot. You don't have to be a great sleuth to spot the borrowing there. The one unusual aspect of Poirot is the fact that he's not English, he's Belgian. And that comes actually from the fact that Agatha Christie was living in Torquay, where she'd been brought up, at the time she started her career as a crime writer. Torquay, during the First World War, had a colony of Belgian refugees, and Agatha Christie was aware of this, and she thought it would be quite a nice idea, good idea. It would give her detective something distinctive if she made him Belgian. She came to bitterly regret this decision as she sat down to write, no doubt, a 25th Poirot novel or something like that. Because one thing she realised was that she knew virtually nothing about Belgium. And in fact, if you're a fan of Agatha Christie, you can see her working out this frustration. I mean, some of her books feature a female detective writer called Ariadne Oliver, who is actually very like Agatha Christie. And the bane of her life is the fact that she's decided to write crime books with a Finnish detective. And apart from Helsinki and Sibelius, she hasn't a great deal to contribute in this line. I think another decision that Agatha Christie would have subsequently regretted was having made Poirot about 67 years old in this first novel. When you're marvelling at Poirot's prowess in the later novels, you must bear in mind that he's well over 100 by the time he is nipping around solving these crimes. I notice that some people say, oh, Poirot, you know, he's a bit torpid, he doesn't move very much. Of course he doesn't, you know. It's amazing he's still amongst us, really. I said that Agatha Christie started writing her stories in Torquay. Torquay is, of course, or was, particularly when Agatha Christie was writing, is a very genteel place, very sedate and staid. And that was the kind of background that Agatha Christie came from. It was an upper middle class family. It was a life very comfortable, very affluent, a life of croquet parties and fancy dress balls and tea on the lawn and so on. And I think that gave her an awareness of what an effective background this kind of setting would be for purposes of contrast and so on in crime fiction. And I think she's the person who really got underway this feature of crime fiction, that terrible things happen in rectories, vicarages, sleepy, picturesque villages and so on. The titles of her novels often bring this out with incongruities. The body in the library, the murder at the vicarage. During the First World War in Torquay, Agatha Christie worked as a volunteer nurse, which again was very influential on her fiction. She worked in the hospital dispensary, which actually seems to have been a rather sinister establishment, because she had a boss who, from her accounts of him, was extremely creepy. He liked to walk around with a lump of poison, curare, in his pocket, because he said it gave him a sense of power. And poison is actually which poison, of course, is a fairly non-messy mode of murder on the whole, especially the way it's presented in Agatha Christie's novels. That's the means of murder that she really loves. On my reckoning, 83 of her characters die of poisoning. In the very first one, someone is dispatched with a lethal cocktail of potassium bromide and strychnine. And one of her very best novels, I think, is one called Sparkling Cyanide. And she always said that of all the reviews she received in the course of her very long lifetime of writing, the one that gave her most pleasure and satisfaction and made her feel proudest was one that appeared in, of all places, the Pharmaceutical Journal, and complimented her on the fact that her knowledge of poisons could not be faulted. I said earlier on that Colonel Hastings, in The Mysterious Affair at Styles, had been invalided home from the Western Front. Poirot is also a Belgian refugee, another kind of casualty of the First World War. And it's sometimes argued that the enormous popularity of crime fiction after the First World War was related to the carnage on the Western Front, that after all that meaningless slaughter, readers liked being taken into a world where violence could be explained and resolved and got rid of. There was something slightly therapeutic there. There's something consoling and relaxing and reassuring about the books, even though they're dealing with violent material. And certainly Agatha Christie was the person who helped to get this widely into circulation. As you'll no doubt know, she wrote books about two detectives, Hercule Poirot, about whom she wrote 33 novels and a lot of short stories, and Miss Jane Marple, about whom she wrote 12 novels and, again, quite a lot of short stories. They're both reassuring figures. Poirot is presented, he's from the Holmes mould, he's presented as intellect incarnate. He's a dapper, less daunting version of Auguste Dupin or Sherlock Holmes. He's someone, like them, obsessed with orderliness and neatness. Not infrequently actually solves crimes by noticing that something's jarringly out of place. And one of the things he's always doing in the novels is pushing little bits of paper straight and putting vases exactly where they should be placed and so on. He's obsessed with symmetry and precision and the all-importance of what he calls the little grey cells. Miss Marple's a bit different. She's sharp as a needle when it comes to observing things. But she basically solves crimes not so much by deduction as by a kind of Crosy cross-reference. What tends to happen is that a suspect's behaviour will start to awaken suspicions in her because it will suddenly remind her of a rather unsatisfactory gardener who wreaked havoc with her delphiniums before a fete, or a dishonest parlourmaid who pilfered a silver tea caddy in St Mary Mead, the ostensibly placid picture postcard village where she lives, which over the years has come to seem more and more like the homicide capital of the Western world. I think it's only rivalled by Midsummer in the Midsummer Murders on television. Poirot and Miss Marple often refer gravely to evil, but in fact, the crimes that they solve are kept as unmessy as possible, so that things are physically and emotionally undisturbing. What you get in Agatha Christie's novels almost always are very sanitized slaughterings. They're devoid of physical horror and continuing emotional distress. It's something that she was aware of, the fact that her books are puzzles rather than flesh creepers. I mean, she once very deliberately and teasingly underlined this in one of her books, again, I think is extremely good, a novel called Hercule Poirot's Christmas. There's an introductory note to that novel where she says she's written it specially for her brother-in-law because he kept saying to her, "When are you going to write a good, violent murder with lots of blood?" And what she does in this novel is to make it seem at first as though that's exactly what she does. The victim in Hercule Poirot's Christmas is found drenched in blood. The murder scene is very untypically for her, absolutely dripping with it. But this turns out eventually just to be another instance of her customary tricksiness. The blood isn't at all what it first seems to be. And in fact, the plot turns out to depend not on bloodshed, but upon bloodlines, on ancestry and parentage. Well, bamboozling the reader's expectations is, of course, the main aim of Agatha Christie's writing, and also of a lot of other Golden Age writing as well. With Agatha Christie's books, I think she's unrivaled as an ingenious deviser of whodunits. It's very, very hard to guess who the murderer is going to be in an Agatha Christie novel. And that was partly because, in many cases, she hadn't the faintest idea herself while she was writing the book. Fairly recently, her notebooks were published, and they are extraordinary. I mean, they were scribbled down into like cheap jotters and exercise books and so on. Her ideas for plots and things are all jumbled up with telephone messages and recipes in a way that's a bit disconcerting, you know, because you find things like try strychnine in mouthwash, or prussic acid in smelling salts, ? And then buy asparagus for tea. And so, but the other thing that's very, very surprising, it's very surprising to me, is that she often would be halfway through a novel before she decided who the killer was. And I think that turned out to be terrific strength, because that's why you keep thinking, is it this person, is it that person, is it another person? She hadn't decided either, you know, so you go along with that. And of course, she's an absolute mistress of fiendish cunning at plotting. She must have used just about every possible plot permutation and means of misleading her readers. In her books, the murderer may turn out to be the narrator, the person who is apparently intended as the victim, the investigating policeman, even a child. In one novel, all of the suspects committed the murder together. In others, characters you barely notice because they seem not much more than walk-on parts are actually killers. So Agatha Christie is sometimes sniffed at for producing characters who seem stereotypes. But in fact, I think that can be a very useful device for her purposes, because the reader's mind's eye glides over these characters without paying too much attention to them, because they seem just like some stock figure in the background, until Poirot or Miss Marple show that they've got hidden murderous depths. And the same thing is true of her prose, I think. Again, people can be very critical of her prose, which I don't think is so terrible. It's workmanlike, but okay. But it serves its purpose. It's flat and colourless, and it doesn't get in the way of the plot. I mean, what she wants to do is to set a puzzle, and she does that with incredible stripped-down efficiency, I think. Her books are puzzles primarily. They're not contributions to the study of criminal psychology or exhibitions of the horror of homicide. Her titles often highlight the fact that these are games. She likes titles that bring out little patterns, like the ABC murders, or she often has novels with titles that are taken from nursery rhymes, like One to Buckle My Shoe, A Pocket Full of Rye, Five Little Pigs, Three Blind Mice, Hickory Dickory Dock. So again, it's emphasizing the game element. One of her very best novels, in fact, Cards on the Table, is about people playing bridge. And in a way, her novels are almost like this. You're trying to guess what's behind what's on the other side of the card. The 1920s and 1930s were great decades, the great decades, I think, for the vogue of for the crossword puzzle and the jigsaw puzzle. And the whodunit seems to me to fit into this same phenomenon. And of course, Agatha Christie wasn't the only writer producing whodunits in large numbers. There were other writers, often women in Britain, Nio Marsh from New Zealand, Marjorie Allingham, Dorothy L. Sayers. They tend to work within a convention. They produce remarkably similar worlds. They focus on closed little communities, usually, snowbound country houses, and Oxbridge colleges quite often, locked at night, cathedral closes, which were locked up at night as well. They like these little closed-in little communities. I mean, with typical ingenuity, Agatha Christie didn't only realise that, but added variety to it, because she suddenly hit on the idea of having mobile closed communities, like a steamer on the Nile, or an aeroplane flying from Paris to Croydon. So she got a mixture of things. And of course, the setting they all seem to like most of all is the quaint village, the kind of picturesque archetypal English village in which the fatally nosy spinster Miss Goodbody gets garroted when she's cycling to St Saviour's Church to do the altar flowers, or the retired major in Mafficking Cottage expires because somebody puts weed killer in his Worcester sauce. They love this kind of thing, and they love killing people in as complicated a way as possible. The murders in the Golden Age novels are as ingenious and elaborate as they can get. People are stabbed with icicles, they're poisoned with postage stamps, they're stunned to death by being trapped in a tower when church bells are ringing. P.D. James once wrote about Dorothy L. Sayers and said, "The murder in Unnatural Death is implausible. It is not really possible to kill someone by injecting air into a vein, at least not with a normal-sized syringe. I am advised that the syringe would have had to be so large that the patient would be more likely to die of shock on beholding it than from any effects of the injected air. And I personally could have advised Mr. Tallboy in Murder Must Advertise of many simpler and surer ways of killing his blackmailer than by climbing onto the roof and using a catapult through the skylight." I have to say my absolute favourite of these preposterously complicated means of murder is by Nio Marsh in one of her novels that opens with a concert in a village hall, and a female performer sits down sedately at the piano to play a piece by Rachmaninoff. And everything goes well for a few minutes, and then she presses her foot down on the soft pedal, and a booby-trapped shotgun hidden inside the piano lid shoots her between the eyes. I think that's stretching things a bit, and that's a weakness of the genre. The other weaknesses that go along with it are snobbery and the aristocratic toff detectives like Lord Peter Wimsey or Albert Campion, Roderick Alleyne, and so on. One saw a wonderful cartoon of a butler moving forward, holding a covered dish and lifting it and saying, "Your red herring, my lord." And I think that's very much the kind of world that you're in there. They're socially reactionary novels, but they're ones that were enormously popular. I mean, and were seen very much as an English phenomenon. William Trevor once said, "All over England, it seemed to me," he's talking about when he was younger, "all over England, it seemed to me, bodies were being discovered by housemaids in libraries. Village poison pens were tirelessly at work. There was murder in Mayfair, on trains, in airships, in Palm Court lounges. Golfers stumbled over corpses on fairways. Chief constables awoke to them in their gardens. We had nothing like it in West Cork." This was a kind of fiction that maintained its fascination for decades. Then in the 1960s, things started to change. The genre began to show an ability to evolve, to adapt to new social circumstances without losing its distinctive character. Two writers stand out here, P.D. James and Ruth Rendell. I'd probably not say very much about them now, since we're going to be talking later this afternoon. But, I mean, basically what I would say is that what they do is to move traditional detective fiction towards greater depth and psychological, moral and emotional subtlety, while keeping the traditional features that give the genre its great appeal. I think I'll wait when I'm talking this afternoon more about that. But it's an attempt to do new things with crime fiction, and also to make, not to lose things like the great restriction, the concentration on closed communities and so on. And their ability to do new things with this fiction seems to me absolutely extraordinary. One other thing that they do, particularly P.D. James, is to put much more emphasis on the pain of a murder investigation. The way she always says that murder is a contaminating crime, pain to other people, and she focuses on the horror of the death. For her, I think one of the big moments in her novels is always when the body is found, and she describes it in very powerful ways. Recently, so that's moving slightly away from the Cluedo to the cadaver aspect of fiction, if you like. Recently in America, there's been a very marked swing towards the cadaver side of things, huge stress on gruesome injury and so on. I think the two most spectacular practitioners are Patricia Cornwell and Kathy Reichs. Title of Cornwell's first novel, Post Mortem, strikes the keynote, and a novel by Kathy Wright, 206 Bones, like the number of bones in the human body, does the same kind of thing. What happens with them is that the corpse isn't just, as in Golden Age crime fiction, a pretext for a teasing puzzle. It's actually the centre of attention. Where the Golden Age novelists usually try to distract your attention from the dead body and its mess as quickly as possible, it's just really a pretext for getting the puzzle set up. These forensic crime detective novels delve into it with relish. The corpse becomes the focus of minute forensic inquiry, often described in unsparing detail. I mean, both of these writers have backgrounds in medicine, and their detectives are women who are experts in forensic pathology. The actual narratives tend to be just repetitive horror tales about serial killers, but the ingenuity and the engrossment lie in the investigation of the injuries and the mutilations. There's absolutely no shirking the hideousness of the corpse. The detective pathologists matter-of-factly refer to things like an ooze of liquefied brain tissue, or the seething yellow blanket of pale yellow maggots inside a body bag. Again, it's a long way from Miss Marple. And they don't only do that, they speak often in a dauntingly technical way. They say things to one another like, her PGM's 1+, 1-, her PEP is A1, her EAP is CB, ADA1 and AK1. When I read stuff like that, I feel a really strong nostalgia for the world of Conan Doyle, where Sherlock Holmes can tell by looking at a crumpled tram ticket that it must have belonged to a one-armed, cigar-smoking Russian Tsarist exile currently renting premises above an oyster restaurant in Whitechapel. What's interesting about the forensic detective novels is that they don't move away from the mess of murder to clues like the the Golden Age books. They find clues in the mess of murder. So the puzzle corpse setup is relocated, but it's still there. And I want to end just by briefly speaking about this. It seems to me that this tension between Cluedo and cadavers, as I put it, is always going to be present in crime fiction, because I think that there's something in the imagination of the best crime writers that isn't just drawn to murder, but to pattern. I think crime writers tend to be very tidy-minded people. They love patterns. If you think of something like the American crime writer Sue Grafton, she's done a whole series of detective novels that whose titles are working their way through the alphabet. She started decades ago with A as for Alibi, and she's now just recently got to V as for Vengeance. Heaven knows what she'll do after, I don't know what Z would be for, Zoo or something. And sometimes Another aspect of this taste for neatness is that they like to mark off particular territory for themselves, and they set their murder mystery within it. You're going to hear a lot more about this in the next lecture, because of course Oxford is one of the areas that has very much been marked out as a big centre for fictional homicide. Colin Dexter is a really good example of this. I mean, Dexter is someone who's very drawn to puzzles. He was a national crossword champion. He fills his books with subsidiary puzzles as well as the murder mystery. I mean, for a long time there was this big conundrum: what is Inspector Morse's first name? It begins with E, but what is it? And of course, all his Morse novels are set in Oxford. I think by the time Morse retired, he'd witnessed the filling of 81 body bags in Oxford with corpses murdered in Oxford, including 3 heads of colleges. And there are lots and lots of other murder mysteries set in Oxford as well. It's a highly hazardous place, Oxford, if you believe crime fiction. I mean, if you work on that or something, I mean, statistically, it's very unlikely that all of you will make it home tonight. And I would be very, very careful what you eat for lunch. I'd have brought packed sandwiches if I'd have been you. And there are other places, like other cities like this: Ian Rankin's Edinburgh, Donnellyon's Venice, Stephen Saylor's Ancient Rome, or eras like one of my favourite living contemporary crime writers, C.J. Sansom, his Tudor England crime novels. Well, everywhere you look in crime fiction, detective fiction nowadays, and it is, as you'll all be aware, a massively thriving and popular genre. Everywhere you look, you see authors whose imaginations are animated by a kind of force field between 2 opposing poles, between the desire to create brain-teasing patterns and a fascination with the disorder and the derangement that murder represents. It's a force field that I hope and think will long continue, because for more than a century now, it's generated a wealth of distinctive and compelling fiction. Thank you.